When we think about history's greatest revolutions, we tend to focus on the people, the ideologies, the battles, but we often overlook where these revolutions actually happen. Cities have always been the beating heart of political movements, shaping the way revolutions unfold and ultimately deciding their success or failure. Urban geography isn't just a backdrop, it's a battleground. The way a city is built, how its streets connect, and where power is centralized, these factors influence everything from protest tactics to military strategies. And it's not just about rebels on the ground. Governments have used city infrastructure to their advantage, controlling movement, communication, and resources to crush uprisings before they even begin. But here's the question. In an era of globalization, digital activism, and decentralized movements, how has the role of the city in revolution changed? And more importantly, what does that mean for the future of political uprisings? Revolutions don't happen in a vacuum. They unfold in real physical spaces. The layout of a city can influence the trajectory of an uprising, giving revolutionaries an advantage or making government crackdowns easier. And few places illustrate this better than Paris. Paris has always had a history of protests and revolutions, the most notable being the French Revolution of the late 18th century. And the city's geography has played a huge role in shaping how those uprisings played out. Back in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Paris wasn't the modern, well-planned city we know today. Instead, it was a maze of narrow, winding streets, perfect for revolutionaries, but a nightmare for soldiers trying to keep order. Revolutionaries knew how to use this to their advantage. One of their go-to tactics? Barricades. These were makeshift roadblocks built from anything they could find. Furniture, cobblestones, wooden carts. They were meant to slow down or trap enemy forces. Instead of open battlefields, soldiers found themselves forced into tight, chaotic street fights, where they were oftentimes outmaneuvered. This strategy wasn't just used in the French Revolution. It was a major factor in the June Rebellion of 1832, which Victor Hugo famously wrote about in Les Miserables. In fact, Hugo himself got caught up in the chaos. He was in the Tuileries Gardens writing a play when gunfire erupted. Barricades blocked his way out. This forced him to take cover behind a wall while gunfire shot from either side. But Paris didn't stay this way forever. In 1853, Emperor Napoleon III put Baron Georges Eugene Haussmann in charge of redesigning the city. The changes were massive. Entire medieval neighborhoods were torn down, a modern sewage system was introduced, and most importantly, open spaces were created. Wide boulevards and large public squares replaced the cramped, winding streets, making it way harder for revolutionaries to control the city. If we fast forward to May 1968, we can see the long-term impact of Haussmann's redesign. A wave of civil unrest, starting with student protests and growing into a general strike that involved over 10 million workers, swept through France. Protesters took to the streets just like in past revolutions, but this time the wide streets and open spaces worked against them. Instead of using barricades to control movement, they were left exposed, making it much easier for police to break up demonstrations. As a result, protesters had to adapt, shifting their focus to occupying university buildings and other key structures rather than controlling the streets. And this isn't just a Paris thing. We see the same principles applied elsewhere, most notably in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. In 1989, thousands gathered to protest the Chinese Communist Party. They demanded political and economic reforms. But the vast open space meant the government had total control over the area. When the crackdown came, tanks and heavily armed soldiers were able to move in freely, leading to one of the most infamous massacres in modern history. The design of the space itself played a role in how the government was able to suppress dissent so effectively. So what does all this mean? It shows that urban design isn't just about making cities look nice or function efficiently, it can literally shape the outcome of political movements. The shift from the barricade-friendly streets of old Paris to the open, government-controlled spaces of today highlights how those in power have learned to design cities in ways that make uprisings harder to sustain. Cities aren't just population centers, they're strategic battlegrounds. Controlling a city means controlling its economy, its government, and most importantly, the flow of information and movement. Throughout history, revolutionaries and military strategists have understood this. If you want to take power, you have to take control of the city's key points. One of the most famous examples of this is the October Revolution of 1917. After Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, Russia's provisional government took charge, but it didn't last long. On October 24th, the Bolsheviks led by Vladimir Lenin launched a military operation to overthrow the government. They didn't just storm the Winter Palace though. Before that, they took control of key infrastructure across Petrograd, which is now modern-day St. Petersburg. The Bolsheviks seized telegraph offices, rail stations, bridges, and government buildings. Controlling the Central Telegraph Office meant cutting off the government's ability to call for reinforcements while securing their own reinforcements from Helsinki. And by securing the major bridges, Nikolaevsky, Dvortsovy, Troitsky, Lytainy, They ensured they could actually reach and take over the Winter Palace. The success of the revolution didn't come from sheer numbers or brute force, it came from controlling the systems that made the city function. Fast forward to the 1950s and we see a similar emphasis on controlling urban movement during the Cuban Revolution. While this conflict is often associated with Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, guerrilla warfare, urban insurgents played a crucial role as well. In cities like Havana and Santiago, revolutionaries worked to disrupt daily life and restrict government control. Highways were blockaded, bridges were destroyed, and public transit workers, including bus drivers and taxi drivers, were encouraged to go on strike. Sabotaging railways was another key tactic, with the most famous example being the derailment of an armored train in Santa Clara. During the Battle of Santa Clara on December 29, 1958, Guevara's forces used a bulldozer to tear up the railway tracks, causing the train carrying Cuban government troops to derail. Trapped inside, the soldiers were bombarded with Molotov cocktails, leading to a decisive victory for the revolutionaries. The derailment of the train was crucial to gaining supplies for the revolutionaries and killing morale for the Cuban soldiers. Beyond physical control of movement, revolutionaries also understood the power of controlling information. Instead of relying solely on traditional propaganda, Cuban insurgents launched secret radio stations known as Radio Rebelde. These broadcasts spread tactical information, revolutionary messaging, and even misinformation. They oftentimes exaggerated the size of their forces to intimidate government troops and rally support. If we move to 1956, we can see a similar strategy of controlling information during the Hungarian Revolution. This uprising was driven by frustration with Soviet control, which had left Hungary in economic and political turmoil. Protesters took to the streets, but one of their most powerful weapons wasn't a barricade or a rifle, it was radio. Radio Free Europe, RFE, was a broadcasting organization funded by the CIA that provided news and information to audiences behind the Iron Curtain. All of this being during the Cold War, it became a key player in spreading revolutionary sentiment. It didn't just report on the uprising, it gave tactical advice, sometimes even instructing people how to make Molotov cocktails at home. More than that, it motivated people to resist. A survey of 1,000 Hungarian refugees later revealed that 90% of them had listened to foreign radio, with 81% of them tuning into RFE regularly. This was an early example of how controlling the flow of information can shape a revolution, but today the way information spreads has changed dramatically. In modern uprisings, communication isn't controlled by a single organization, it's decentralized. Social media platforms have replaced radio as the tool of choice for organizing protests, sharing tactics, and spreading revolutionary ideas in real time. If the October Revolution and the Hungarian Uprising were about seizing telegraphs and radio towers, then today's movements are about controlling narratives on digital platforms. Looking back, movements like the French Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, or the Hungarian Uprising are often romanticized. They feel like moments in history that couldn't happen today, especially when governments have unprecedented power, from mass surveillance to military capabilities that can wipe out entire cities. But in recent years, protesters have adapted in ways never seen before. Now they aren't just fighting for control of the urban landscape, they're also battling for dominance in the digital landscape. One of the most striking examples of this was the Arab Spring from 2010 to 2012. It all started when Mohamed Bouazizi, a Tunisian street vendor, set himself on fire to protest government corruption and police brutality. His self-immolation served as an act of defiance that set off a wave of mass protests across the Middle East and North Africa. Tunisia's uprising successfully led to the removal of its president and a transition to democracy, but in other places, the outcomes were far less hopeful. Protests in Bahrain were crushed almost immediately. Yemen, Syria, and Libya descended into long-term civil wars. And then there was Egypt, a country where a brief period of democracy was only made possible by protesters who strategically used both the city's physical geography and the new digital landscape. In Egypt, figures like Wael Ghonim understood the power of the internet. Ghonim created the We Are All Khalid Saeed Facebook page, originally meant to highlight police brutality. But as protests gained momentum, the page became a hub for organizing mass demonstrations. In Cairo, activists gathered in Tahrir Square, an ideal location surrounded by embassies, government buildings, and media centers. This made it the perfect place to draw both domestic and international attention. But if you've been listening, we've already seen how these large open spaces make it easier for governments to crack down, and this is true with these protests in Egypt. But early on, protesters used nearby alleyways to their advantage. They moved between them to evade police before law enforcement adapted. For a moment, the combination of urban strategy and online coordination gave the revolutionaries an edge, one that briefly changed Egypt's political landscape. Fast forward to 2019, and similar tactics played out in the anti-extradition law amendment bill movement, or what is more commonly known as just the Hong Kong protests. The protests erupted over a proposed law that would allow extraditions to mainland China. This raised fear that Hong Kong's judicial independence would be undermined. Unlike Cairo, though, these protests weren't led by a single Facebook group or a single movement or a single leader. They were completely decentralized. Protesters used encrypted messaging apps like Telegram to coordinate pop-up demonstrations. This allowed them to gather in one district, make their statement, make their message known, and quickly disappear before police could react. The dense high-rise layout of Hong Kong gave them natural cover, and messaging apps allowed them to track police movements in real time. This guerrilla-like strategy became known as "be like water," a reference to Bruce Lee's philosophy. Instead of holding fixed positions, protesters would keep moving, adapting, shifting, and refusing to be pinned down in one area of the city. And for a while, it did work. Pro-democracy politicians gained traction, and the movement drew global attention. But in the end, crackdown came. China tightened its grip on Hong Kong, and they stripped away even more freedoms and suppressed future dissent in the Hong Kong region. What these modern movements show is that while tactics of revolution have evolved, the core strategy remains the same. Control communication, control movement, and control the narrative. But as technology continues to advance, the nature of future uprisings will likely evolve in ways we can't yet predict. Governments are becoming more adept at digital surveillance, deploying AI to monitor defiance, and using cyber tools to disrupt organizing efforts before they even begin. At the same time, activists are deploying new ways to communicate anonymously, spread information rapidly, and coordinate with essential leadership. The next major revolution may not take place in the streets at all. It could be fought in the digital space, through mass data leaks, digital sabotage, or AI-driven counter-propaganda. As history has shown, revolutions don't disappear, they adapt. The only question is, what would they look like next?